Recently, the academic agent has published 3 excellent videos which thoughtfully explore the libertarian tradition. They provocatively argue that libertarianism has failed to prevent, and has even been a handmaiden for, the implementation of socialist ideas in Western societies. AA contends that the libertarian emphasis upon the individual, their rights to freedom, and the end of material happiness are at root shared with the socialist. If granted, this means that the liberal tradition agrees with socialist thought on the ends by which society should be ordered, while differing on how these ends can be achieved. In the last video, AA contrasted libertarianism with a medieval worldview to emphasize that its focus on the individual and their freedom from constraint to pursue their inclinations is in opposition to conservative and traditional ideas of human nature and societal order. The divergence AA presented between medieval and libertarian values provoked me to consider why individualism, materialism, and freedom became important in Western thought. Consequently, over the coming days and weeks, I hope to produce some videos which provide a survey, by no means exhaustive, which track the intellectual and cultural changes that underpin the values integral to libertarianism. In this first video, we are going to look at how changes in the philosophical theory of knowledge paved the way for individualism. Before we begin, it will be very useful to make an important distinction between a priori and a posteriori kinds of knowledge. We know something a priori if it can be known without experience. An example would be the following statement: all bachelors are unmarried men. I can know this using reason alone, because a bachelor is defined as an unmarried man, so it follows that every bachelor is an unmarried man. By contrast, if something is known a posteriori, it is known through experience. For example, the proposition "the Eiffel Tower is in Paris" is an a posteriori statement, because I can only know if it is true or false through observation of where the Eiffel Tower is. I cannot know it through abstract reasoning alone, as there is nothing intrinsic to the concept of the Eiffel Tower or Paris, which means the Eiffel Tower has to be in Paris by logical necessity. Thus, it is through experience, whether my own or someone else's, that I can know if the Eiffel Tower is in Paris. Most of what we know about the world is through experience of the world, and as such, a posteriori knowledge has been the main focus of epistemology. And so when I say that such and such a philosopher thinks we know something in this regard, I'm talking about a posteriori knowledge in the main. In the medieval era, the dominant interpretations of a posteriori knowledge were Aristotelian. Aristotle's epistemology was built upon his theory of forms. In his view, every thing is a substance which has properties. These qualities are forms which the substance instantiates. For example, Scooby-Doo is a dog, and so for Aristotle, Scooby, the substance, possesses the form of dogness. As he is brown, he also has the form of brownness, while his tongue being red has the form of redness, and so on. Importantly, Aristotle argued that forms are shared between substances. So, Goofy the dog possesses the same form of dogness as Scooby-Doo, but being black rather than brown, he does not share Scooby's form of brownness. It is because Scooby and Goofy share the exact same form of dogness that we can recognize that they are of the same kind, that they are both dogs. Now, for the medieval Aristotelian, a posteriori knowledge is a knowledge of forms. When we perceive an object by one or more of our senses, our sensory faculties abstract from the substance its perceptible forms. These are relayed to the imagination, a capacity which has the ability to store forms just as wax retains the imprint of a stamp. Refined in the imagination, the form is then presented to the understanding as an object of knowledge. Crucially, what is received by the senses is not a representation of a form. Rather, it is the form itself, the quality shared between substances, that enters the mind. To paraphrase Aristotle, knowledge is identical with its object. As such, a posteriori knowing is a kind of opening oneself up to the world and letting it penetrate into your mind, into your consciousness. Charles Taylor has characterized the Aristotelian subject as porous, as external realities, such as the forms, can in some sense be within a subject's consciousness, a concept difficult for modern people to comprehend. While most medieval people were not Aristotelian scholars like Thomas Aquinas, the idea that the external world could come within the self was commonplace. In the weekly Mass, the congregation usually observed the host, transformed into the body and blood of Christ, the sight of which was thought to translate Christ's power and being into the soul. It was also a popular belief that temptations and doubts were caused by and marked the presence of Satan within a person's consciousness. Cases of demonic possession, the supernatural inhabiting a human body and soul. Similarly, God was thought to speak and act within a person, changing their thoughts and emotions, and more extreme, mystics experiencing God, filling their souls in episodes of ravishing ecstasy. The soul, then, was like a stage upon which God, Satan, and the world could act, a place where the self and the other could meet. This was no isolated individual. The person, the soul, the self, was always in dynamic interrelation with its surroundings. The Enlightenment ushered in a revolution in theories of knowledge, overturning medieval Aristotelianism. René Descartes, following his skeptical method, concluded that the only certainty was the self, a thinking subject, exists. This idea was conceivable for Descartes because he abandoned Aristotle's theory of forms. No longer does self-perception abstract and place in the mind a form, an other, something real beyond ourselves that we know is real and independently existing from us. The senses for Descartes present to the thinking subject a representation of the world, rather than the world itself, and as representations can be wrong, one can doubt their authenticity. His ideas were refined by the empiricist John Locke. He claimed that objects produce ideas and sensations in knowing subjects. The primary qualities of an object, those properties which exist mind-independently, such as its shape and motion, stimulate the senses to produce ideas in the mind representing the actual object. The secondary properties of the object, such as its colour, taste, smell, and sound, are the subjective sensations evoked by the object in the knower's mind. Immanuel Kant pushed this trajectory of thought to its logical extreme. His epistemology aimed to save knowledge from David Hume's philosophical skepticism, which eliminated categories such as causation because they are not known through reason alone or experience alone. You cannot see a cause, but rather you observe a succession of events. Thus, causation does not exist. So goes David Hume. In response, Kant argued that all experiential knowledge is shaped by the mind of the knower. We do not just experience a succession of events, as Hume suggested. Instead, our minds synthesize and represent our experiences through the categories of space, time, and causation. It is impossible to know something by experience without presupposing that there is something in space which, although changing, has a unity through time that has a causal relationship with other things, This is just how we experience the world. We cannot get away from it. Additionally, there must be something beyond experience which represents sensory experiences through these categories. The knower, what Kant calls the transcendental unity of apperception. As our experiences are necessarily mediated through the categories of space, time, and causation, we can only ever know the world as it appears to us. We can never experience what it is like in itself without our minds providing a sense of unity to what we perceive, so as to make it intelligible and coherent. Thus, in Kant's theory of knowledge, there is a solitary knower who has no experiential access to the world in itself. Unknowable, many neo-Kantians proceeded to eliminate the noumenal world in itself, arguing that there is only the knower and the world as it appears. Enlightenment epistemologies challenged the medieval Aristotelian idea that through experience we can know the world directly, because in some sense it enters into us. To use Charles Taylor's language again, philosophers considered the knowing subject to be a buffered self, a self-contained and impenetrable reality. Its sense perceptions at best mediated a representation of the world in itself, at worst the world only of appearance. There is a clear sense of the subject being apart from the object of its apprehension, so much so that it may not even have access to the object's true nature via experience. These theories of knowledge, thus, present the knower as an isolated individual who remains untouched by what they experience. The 19th century Scottish philosopher Andrew Seth Blingle Patterson articulated this idea clearly and starkly. Each self is a unique existence, which is perfectly impervious, if I may so speak, to other selves. The self, accordingly, resists invasion. It refused to admit another self within itself. The characterization of the knowing self as a solitary entity by Enlightenment thinkers provided a foundation upon which ethical and political intellectual systems which focused on the individual agent could emerge. Locke's classical liberalism, which treated individuals as the basic unit of society, emerged from his belief that human nature is fundamentally solitary, insofar as it is an isolated knowing subject. Similarly, Kant's deontological ethics, which concentrates upon the responsibilities of the individual agent, emerges from within his view that fundamentally humans are lonely knowers trapped in a world of appearances. The shift towards individualism in epistemology, and by extension in the consideration of human nature, provided an impetus and basis for the same shift in ethical and political philosophy, which paved the way and established the libertarian tradition.